Thank you so much for inviting me here. We are a far cry from where we were at this time 10 years ago.
Well, it really is. I said both the distance and the weather, but really the times are so different in some ways. But yeah, on the flip side, not so much in Wisconsin, but in America, there are some similarities in terms of the unrest. And remember, a decade plus ago, we were facing an economic and a fiscal crisis both in Wisconsin and around the country. And in some ways, we're facing some of that again now.
And that led to that moment. Shortly after we had that wonderful election night victory party, we were right in the talks for budget, and we realized that there were things that needed to happen.
Yeah, what was interesting, it comes out of necessity, right? I mean, you from the day, the very first day after the election, we started meeting as a transition team with the budget staff, with other folks about the cabinet. You were there every step of the way, which obviously helped you understand the budget process both then and now going forward. But I remember one of those days when we were talking about how the gap in the budget, the deficit we were facing, was actually far greater than had been reported publicly before our election. And we had to both make it up in a budget repair bill immediately, and then we had this about $3.6 billion gap going into the next budget. And we looked at all the options, and we weren't going to raise taxes because not only we said we weren't going to, but it would have been a wet blanket on the state's economy.
We were trying to recover.
Oh, it just been devastating. We weren't going to lay off 10 to 15,000 public employees. As much as you and I believe in limited government, you don't do it through random pink slips. You do it through targeted, focused reform. And we certainly weren't going to cut billions of dollars from Medicaid. As much as I wanted to get people back to work and off of Medicaid, in the short haul, it would have hurt children and families and others. So as a local official, I knew the only way you could do that is cutting the amount the state gave to local governments. But I also knew as a local official, if you didn't give me any tools, when Doyle and the Democrats had done it the year before to me as a county official, we were stuck. The union contracts really handcuffed us as to what we could do. So here, I tell people all the time, it wasn't just about the budget, as you know. It was really about transferring power from the hands of the big government special interests, those union bosses, and putting it firmly into the hands of the hardworking taxpayers and the people they elect to run their schools and their local and state government.
So what surprised me about the entire process, not having ever been in government, I was always in business and, as you know, a journalist for many years. What surprised me was we're coming out of a recession, and clearly the taxpayers who have been paying the bills for government this entire time without a break, because we had a taxing governor, a Democrat governor. He didn't give folks a break in the middle of a recession. What you asked for was just a state employee, a government employee contribution to retirement benefits that they were going to get, and then also to health insurance that was also theirs, and then some changes to the way unions bargain with government. But what shocked me, the journalist in me, facts, only facts, and also the business person in me, was that anyone was going to react unreasonably to this. And I remember the night at your residence when you sat the entire cabinet down and you warned that this could actually come even to people protesting.
Yeah.
And I thought,
imagine that.
You got it.
Now it seems like nothing in comparison, right?
But I thought, you gotta be kidding me. Come on. I mean, these people are reasonable. They've all been through the recession. Of course they're not going to protest. Was I wrong?
Well, and in a way I knew, having been in the county where it was almost 3-1 Democrat over Republican, I knew some of the pushback. So I expected a little bit, but obviously nowhere near the amount that we had. But I want to go back to a second to something you talked about, the realistic amounts that we asked for, the reasonable amounts that we asked for, including both you and I paying and our families paying. And we actually ran ads, people forget, in the campaign in 2010, talking about making a pension and a healthcare contribution, and including us personally as governor and lieutenant governor and our teams. And most people thought that made sense. I remember my brother talking about, in the midst of the protests, going to church. He lived in a different community than I did at the time. And he said the first week, a couple of the public employees who were there, the fellow parishioners were empathizing with it. Oh, it's too bad. What's the governor doing to you? This sounds horrible. And he said by the second Sunday, they stopped talking about it. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, when they first were commiserating, they thought that they were being attacked and they had to pay all this. And people said, oh, is he making you pay for all of your health insurance? And he said, they're making us pay for health insurance. And they said, well, how much are you paying now? And I think these were both school employees at the time. They said, well, nothing. And they said, instead of being mad at me, it shifted to being mad at the public employees, saying, you don't pay anything for your health insurance? That's outrageous. And so it totally shifted, and they stopped talking about it because most people, like my brother and my sister-in-law and their families, working hard to make ends meet, are paying 20-25% of their health insurance premiums, and they're lucky if they even have a retirement plan. They're looking at public employees and saying, you're upset? My goodness, even what the governor's giving you is a deal. And that really, I think, changed things. The more people heard those sorts of stories, the more they heard about the abuses in the system, that changed things. But the national unions came in and they ginned it up. Remember, it went from hundreds to thousands to ultimately over 100,000 people occupying our state capitol.
It was scary. It was scary. I had my first floor office, and I remember looking out the window and seeing the signs and the people who I knew had issued death threats. Do you remember they installed those panic buttons under our desks in case the protesters broke into the office?
Yeah, they weren't for a Diet Coke. They were for Capitol Police.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't fun. It wasn't funny, and it was almost as if they were trying to shut us down, hoping that we would go away, threaten us into going away, and then ultimately, they literally tried to cancel us.
Oh, it's the whole effort you see around the nation, and sadly, it's worked too many times. It's the cancel culture today. Back then, I called it intimidation. It's really both. But they wanted to intimidate us just because they've done it against local officials, state officials, even folks in our federal government, where they put enough pressure on. And the media, all too often, is complicit in this because if people yell loud enough, if they carry enough signs, if they do enough crazy things, they somehow think that's representative. I remember a great story. You remember this, where we got wise a little bit out of your experience. We realized after the first week we had to communicate, so I would hold a press conference every day at 5 o'clock live.
Oh, I remember this.
And it was a great way. It started out with just some of the local stations, then eventually all the state affiliates did it.
You even had international stations.
Oh, we had people. I remember one of the times coming in that conference room, and I could barely get in because there were so many people, cameras and everything else. But one in particular I remember was, as more and more became of this, the protesters were following what we were doing. So right before 5, they get louder and louder and louder. And one of the days when I was taking questions, a reporter, I think, was from NBC News. So it wasn't the local affiliate, the national NBC News, said, well, Governor, don't you hear the voices of the protesters out there? Don't they have a right to be heard? And I'm like, okay, that's not an obnoxious question, but it's not certainly a softball. And I thought for a minute. I said, you know, they do. That's what's great about America. You can protest your government and not have fear of retribution. But let me be clear. There's 1.5 million people at home, probably working today, who voted for me to do exactly what I'm doing. I'm not going to let those voices drown out the people at home.
And today, Wisconsin has saved more than $12 billion. We have a Democrat governor who wouldn't even think of getting rid of Act 10 because its legacy looms so large. We were able to save government jobs ultimately. Still one of only 3 states in the country with no unfunded pension liability. What else is the legacy of Act 10?
Well, there's a couple key ones. You alluded to it. It's not just the financial savings, and the ultimate test of its success is exactly what you said. Tony Evers, the current and hopefully temporary governor of Wisconsin, put a budget in front of a Republican majority legislature that was a manifesto of the left. It was every left-wing crazy idea. And so clearly, he and his team knew that most of those things were not going to get through. It was really his appeasement to the far, far left that was behind his campaign effort. And yet they didn't put a repeal of Act 10. That's telling, because some people would say, oh, well, he knew it wouldn't get through. He knew all these other things weren't going to get through either. Why did he do it? Because if you undid Act 10, if you went back to the way things were before, it would devastate public education, government-run education in Wisconsin. It would devastate local governments because they have used that, not just to balance their budget, but to make things better. Good example of that was the teachers union affiliated healthcare system previous to Act 10 had almost all the contracts for health insurance in the state. Well, when we changed things with our reforms, school districts across the state could bid that out, and they saved millions and millions of dollars, money that could go right back into the classroom.
And not only that, not only helping education, not only saving money, not only saving government jobs and preserving services, also leveling the playing field so that the people paying taxes in the private sector are not the taxpayer have-nots,
Right.
and those serving in public service jobs are the haves. You created a level of equality, I suppose, in Wisconsin that had been unseen until that moment.
Well, and if you live in this bubble, like so many, not only in our state houses, but even in our nation's capital do, where they only hear from these special interests, where they only hear, like sadly Joe Biden, I think, even though his CDC director slipped the other day and said it's safe to go back to school, and then they backed away from that, realizing it wasn't the American people or even scientists making the decision, it was the union bosses. But in this case, same sort of scenario. If you're only hearing from them, you don't get it. But I remember going to schools, which sounds amazing. The government-run schools in the midst of the protest, and even meeting with teachers as well as touring with students. And I could always tell the teachers who were sympathetic because they'd look both ways and then they'd lean in and whisper that they were for us. And what I found was almost universally, those teachers had a spouse who ran a business. In fact, a lot of times they might do the books or in some way be engaged. So they knew what they were paying their employees and what their employees were paying for things like health insurance and retirement. The teachers and the other public employees who were the most rabid in opposition to Act 10, conversely, were almost always ones where both spouses worked for a school district where they paid nothing. Which, it's not right, but at least I could get that. I understand if your world is, neither of us pay health insurance, you have no clue that your neighbor, people like my brother David was paying $700 a month for his family health insurance, and the little bit he could set aside for the 401k, they might be a little bit envious of the fact that even under Act 10, you're now paying maybe $50 a paycheck. Really still a great benefit that most people had taken for granted before because they lived in that bubble.
Well, we are very far out of the bubble today. A rainy day in Miami, and bizarrely enough, in Miami because you are right now coaching a fresh new generation of conservatives in how you make bold decisions and how you stand on a firm foundation for freedom and what America stands for. Are you proud to be able to stand on a platform of the things that you have done in the past as governor of Wisconsin?
Well, absolutely. What we've done, what you and I as partners, what our friends in the legislature, it really is remarkable what we think about, what we were able to accomplish, not just through Act 10, but all the other reforms. We got to the lowest unemployment rate ever, more people working in Wisconsin than at any point in the history of our grand state. When you look at budget surpluses, as you mentioned, a fully funded pension system, a massive rainy day fund, all sorts of things that we've done, and still performing great services for the people of our state, transformational. But I also look back to what we faced at that time 10 years ago and realize how similar it is today. I'm proud to be the president of Young America's Foundation because what we're teaching young people to focus in on is that common sense conservative reforms work and that they're not alone. The left tried to intimidate us. The unions, the special interests tried to intimidate us. It's exactly what they're doing, trying to cancel conservative thought on campuses and our culture. We're even seeing it now in big tech and conversations and censorship. That's happening all across this country.
Thank you for what you're doing for the future of conservative politics in America. Thanks for what you're doing for this country, and thank you for what you did for Wisconsin.
Our pleasure. Forward.